Our scripture reading this morning is from the second chapter of Philippians. They try to get this thing to go. And we may just abandon it. Oh, look at that. Man. Okay. Second chapter of Philippians. So we're still in our study of Philippians. And just to kind of bring us up to date, after the introduction in which Paul talks to the Philippians about his circumstances, he was imprisoned in Rome. And he talks about his attitude toward his imprisonment. And it's really remarkable because he says stuff like, I want you to know that what has happened to me actually has served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. So he says, even though I'm in prison, he says, I want you to know that it's good. It's a good thing because it has served to advance the gospel. He says, people who normally would not have had an opportunity to hear the gospel are now hearing the gospel, the palace guard, the Praetorian Guard. And he says, on top of that, other Christians have been emboldened to share the gospel. And some, even though some are preaching the gospel to try to get under my skin, try to make trouble for me out of wrong motives, he says, I still rejoice in that because the gospel is going out, and I don't care what their motives are. So Paul really models this attitude, this lifestyle of rejoicing. Then in chapter 2, he appeals to the Philippians he urges them to conduct themselves, in verse 27 of chapter 1, urges them to conduct themselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And then he shows what that means in chapter 2. He appeals to them to be unified in spirit, not to only look out after their own selfish interests and their own individual concerns, but to also consider the needs of others. In fact, he says, consider the needs of others as more important than your own. Then in verses 5 through 11, which we looked at last week, he gives the example of Jesus Christ in what many people believe is an ancient Christian hymn. There's poetry in this. There's meter in the statements, and many believe that maybe Paul didn't write this, but he quotes this as an ancient Christian hymn talking about Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider his equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but made himself nothing, taking on himself the nature of a servant, and being found in human likeness, he humbled himself, becoming obedient even to death on the cross. So he gives an example of humility in Jesus Christ. Jesus became humble and obedient to the point of death on the cross. Then he tells us this is how we ought to behave toward one another. This is how our attitude, our mindset, as the NIV says, ought to be toward one another as we have relationships with each other. We ought to be like Jesus. And we asked that question, what would Jesus do, last week? So this week, he's going to give us some very concrete applications of how to live this out, how to live a life worthy of the gospel. But before we get to that, we want to look at, we do. We want to look at Paul's paradox, okay? Because we start this passage with a paradox. And here's what let me read this for you. I'm going to read it from here because I can't see the little bitty type up there. Read it there. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. So, did you catch the paradox? Here's the paradox. At verse 12, Paul says, work out your salvation. In verse 13, Paul says, God works in you. So which is it, Paul? Are we supposed to work out our own salvation? Or does God work in us? It goes back to the old question, the free will and sovereignty, right? And we get so caught up in our particular view, our understanding, our theologies, our favorite theologies, that we tend to emphasize one side and de-emphasize the other. So some groups emphasize the free will. You got to work out your salvation. And other people emphasize the sovereignty of God. It is God who works in you. And really, it is both and. It is both. You need to apply this, but it's God that works in you. Now, Paul says, remember, Jesus said, notice he starts with this concept of obedience. He says, just as you have obeyed in the past, obey now, not only in my presence, but also in my absence. So he starts with this concept of obedience. This is on the heels of what he has said about Jesus. In verse 8, Jesus became obedient even to death on the cross. So Jesus was obedient to God the Father's plan, even though it meant his death. Remember, Jesus said to his disciples in the upper room on the night before he was betrayed, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. So it's not just that we come to God, we come to Christ. A lot of people, why are you saved? Well, I'm saved so I'll be in heaven after I die. Well, that's true, but that's not the reason that God saved you. The reason that God saved you is so that you could become the image of Jesus Christ, so that you could become obedient and live out your salvation. And that's what he means when he says continue to work out your salvation. He's not saying you've got to work for your salvation. You've got to work in order to be saved. Paul wouldn't say that because we know what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 and 9. You are saved by grace through faith, and it's not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not a result of works, lest anyone should boast. So Paul's not going to disagree with himself here. He's not going to say, on the other hand, you have to work for your salvation. When he's talking about salvation here, he's not talking about eternal salvation. Now, we look at the scriptures, and whenever we see the word salvation, because of our evangelical mindset, we see eternal salvation. But here, he's not talking about eternal salvation. He's talking about deliverance in circumstances. He says this earlier, I know that I believe or I am confident that this will work out to my deliverance. He's talking about his imprisonment and his release from imprisonment. And he uses the same word. It's the same word. So there he's not talking about eternal salvation. He's talking about deliverance in his circumstances. Also, we need to point out, or I need to point out, that all of the verbs, now I'm told this, I don't want anyone to think I'm a Greek scholar, because I'm not. I play one on TV, but I'm not known. I take the words of people who are Greek scholars who tell me that all the verbs in these verses are plural. So he's not saying individually, you work out your salvation, but he's saying, you as a church, you Philippians, you work out your salvation. You flesh out your salvation. You live out the implications of salvation as a body. Now, of course, that also applies individually. But he's talking here about that church. You need to flesh out, live out the implications of your salvation as a community of believers. Make manifest, live out the implications of your salvation. Because this is a problem that they had. Now, we look at the Philippian church, and it appears almost like a perfect church. Paul has no, like he doesn't have a lot of accusations, corrections to them like he does for example, the Corinthian church which was a mess. They had all kinds of problems, but the Philippian church is a church that's close to Paul's heart. They shared in his ministry. They sent him gifts to support him even after he left Philippi. They continued to share with him and to work, to give into his ministry. And he had a great love for this church. But yet he does recognize that there is a problem here. There is disunity and disagreement. And we go, you want to see if that's a problem they had, you go to chapter 4, verse 2. And here he pleads with two women in the church, Euodia and Syntyche, to be of the same mind in the Lord. And then he says in verse 3, yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel. So he says, there were these two women in the Philippian church that were in some kind of disagreement. And undoubtedly, they were getting other people on their side. And so you had parties forming up around these. This was the people who supported Euodia, and this was the people who supported Syntyche, and they were arguing, and there was fighting going on in the church. And he says, you guys got to get it together. You guys got to stop thinking about your own concerns all the time and being selfish, and start thinking about the concerns of others. You need to be like Jesus Christ, who gave up his rights, died on the cross. And he says, obey me here and work out your salvation. Live out the implications of your salvation. So, when we come to Christ, there is a responsibility. It's not just all, hey, God does everything and we just got to come and we just got to, have a good time and God takes care of everything else. There is a responsibility to obey. Come to Christ. Salvation is free, but after we are saved, the proof of salvation, the evidence of salvation is obedience. We obey him. If you love me, you will obey me. But on the other side, he says, it is God who works in you. It is our responsibility to live according to the implications of our salvation, but it is God's sovereignty that makes it possible. It is God who gives you, who will enable you to will and to do. He will give you the want to as well as the ability. He will give you, God works in you to will and to act, to will and to act. He will give you the want to. You say, hey, I don't want to obey God. Well, that's a problem, isn't it? God's obviously not working in your heart, because he's going to work in a Christian's heart to want to do, to want to obey, and want to follow. So, that's the beginning. That's Paul's paradox. We're moving on to the next section. So, this is, according to Greek scholars, this is one paragraph. Actually, it's one sentence in the Greek. Well, I think it's one sentence in the English also as well. We move on to Paul's purpose. So this is the why, right? This is how, this is the how. How do you live out your salvation? How do you work out your salvation as a community? How do you manifest that you're saved? And here's the command. Listen to this. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Now, wait a minute. I wish that Paul hadn't said that. I really do, because you're looking at the world's best, number one, whiner. Okay? And I think you can all look at your own selves and you could say, yeah, I'm pretty good at that. Pretty good at complaining. And he says, do everything without grumbling or arguing. Now, I studied the Greek in that, and I found out that everything, you know what it means? It means everything. That's what the Greek word means, everything. So there's no loopholes here. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Because that's what was happening in that church. That's because they were undergoing persecution. Paul says, what you have seen in me and you see in yourselves, they were undergoing persecution as Paul was. Paul had a perfect excuse to grumble. There he was in prison, although he was an innocent person, He was there in prison, perfect excuse to grumble, and yet he did nothing but praise and rejoice. And so he says to them, look, I know you're going through a hard time. I know you're going through persecution. I know it's difficult, but don't grumble or argue. So grumbling, the word is murmuring under your breath. So it's kind of like, well, I'll do that, but you never do that, right? Mumble under your breath. And it reminds us of the Israelites in the wilderness. You remember God had delivered them from slavery in Egypt. He parted the Red Sea, brought them across on dry land. He drowned their enemies. He brought them out into the wilderness, and after a couple of days, they start grumbling. Well, what are we going to drink? And God gives them water, and then a couple of days later, well, what are we going to eat? And God gives them manna, and God gives them quail. Before long, they're grumbling, yeah, well, those Amalekites, they're big guys, and you're going to send us off there to be killed by those people. We should be back there in Egypt, where we sat around pots of meat all day long. It was so good back there in Egypt. And Paul actually mentions that or refers to that in verse 15, which we'll get to later. But he talks to them about the world being children of God without fault. He talks about them being children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. That warped and crooked generation is a reference to Deuteronomy 32:5. And here's what God said about the Israelites. They are corrupt and not his children to their shame. They are a warped and crooked generation. So here's what Paul is saying to the Philippians. Don't be like the Israelites. Don't grumble and complain. They grumbled and complained against Moses and Aaron, and Moses said to them, you know, you're not really complaining about us. You're complaining about God. Because at the root of it, the sin of grumbling is a sin against God. You're basically saying to God, you don't know what you're doing. When you put me in this situation, when you allowed this to happen in my life, when you let these circumstances arise, you didn't know what you were doing. How could you put me here? How could you do this to me? That's grumbling. I didn't finish reading the verse tonight. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Arguing, by the way, is now the grumbling becomes vocal. And we start disputing. It's vocal disputations. We start arguing with one another. We start fighting with one another. Brothers and sisters, is that not the spirit of our time? The arguing, the disputation, the vocal, cable news wouldn't exist if it wasn't for arguing. That's what it exists to do. That is the tenor of all of our discussions. That is the tenor of all of our political conversation. It's arguing and disputing. That's the spirit of the world. Grumbling betrays a lack of trust in God's sovereignty of our life, and it is a terrible advertisement for the gospel. Now, the reason why Paul gives this command, do everything without grumbling or arguing. Why? Well, he goes on to say, let me read it. Because that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able... No, I'm going to stop there. Hold firmly to the word of life. Stop there. Why? Why should we do everything without grumbling or complaining? The reason is the world is watching. The world is watching. Paul says that you may become blameless and pure. That word blameless in the Greek is a word that means above accusation. It means that no one can point a finger at you and say, yeah, they say they're a Christian. They say they trust God, but look how they grumble and complain about their life. If they really trusted God, That you may be blameless, above accusation, no finger pointing, and that you may be pure. The word pure is the idea of a substance, a liquid that has not had any other thing mixed into it. A pure, unmixed. We ought to be pure, unmixed with the world's spirit. Listen how he describes the world here. That you may be blameless and pure, children of God without fault, in a warped, in a warped and crooked generation. This is the first century AD. And he says, look out there, this is what the world is like. It's warped and it's crooked. Now let me ask you, honestly, do you think the world is any better today than it was in the first century? Is it less warped and crooked than it was then? Or is it more warped and crooked? I think you could make a good argument to say that we're more warped and crooked than we were in the first century. When we look out at our culture today, it is a warped and crooked culture. I mean, in terms of, and those words refer to, in terms of their standing before God. They are crooked and warped and twisted. I mean, things that we couldn't even imagine a few years ago now are acceptable. I mean, we were talking about the shootings. I mean, apparently that's the thing you do now. You know, you got some kind of emotional thing and you go out and shoot a bunch of people. I don't know. What's going on? Our world is warped and crooked. We live in the midst of a dark world. So how do we respond? That's the question that Paul is asking. What do we do? Well, I know what a lot of us do. We just get involved in the arguing. We just get all, Christians are great for this. We get all crazy. We get on the side of this, on the side of that, and we argue for this, and we argue for that, and we fight, and the world looks at us and says, how are you different than we are? You're exactly the same. And Paul says, here's what you do. When you live in the midst of a warped and crooked generation, you don't do the same thing they do. You don't go on Facebook and post a bunch of garbage, a bunch of cutting remarks, a bunch of stuff. You don't do that. You shine like stars. It says you shine like stars in the midst of a warped and crooked generation. You give them a contrast. Now, if you look up in the sky, you're in Pixley or Porterville or wherever you are, you look up in the sky, you're going to see a few stars, aren't you? Unless it's smoggy or foggy, but normally. But if you really want to see stars, you go up in the mountains, or you go to one of these national parks where they have, there are national parks where they advertise dark sky parks. Up here, Sequoia is a dark sky park. You could go up there away from the glare from the cities, and you can see stars. And I don't mean a few little bits of stars. I mean, you see stars. You can even see the Milky Way. It's amazing. And the further, I just say this, maybe you'll understand why I'm a backpacker. But one of the reasons I do is you get in the backcountry away from all the lights, and you can see the universe. And you look up there in the darkness of the sky, and it's full of stars. You see, it's the contrast. The darker the darkness, the brighter the stars. Now, we look at the darkness of our culture, and we say, oh, man, that's really bad. It's terrible. How horrible is it? And we start complaining. We start grumbling. But do you see what I'm saying? The darker the darkness, the brighter the stars shine. Stars at night are best seen when the skies are darkest. I would challenge Christians, see yourself in the eyes of the world. When they look at us, when they look at our conversation, our discourse, our our sermons, our the articles that we write, the whatever, you know. What do they see? Do they see a contrast? Do they see stars contrasting with the darkness, or do they just see more darkness? So how do you do this? How do you shine like stars? Paul says, you will shine like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. Hold firmly to the word of life. Greek word that means to grasp firmly. This is a grasp. I'm grasping my Bible. I'm holding on to it firmly. But it's more than just reading the scriptures. It's more than just grasping the scriptures. It's more than just taking a class or studying it in a Sunday school class or whatever. It's allowing the scriptures to grasp you, to get a hold of you. More than reading it, the Bible must inform and transform us. We must, as Christians, develop a biblical worldview. When I was younger, a young believer, that was all the rage. That's what they always talked about. It ain't a biblical worldview. But that's true. We need to see everything through the filter of the scriptures. When we look at our world today, we need to see it through the filter of the scriptures. What does the Bible say about that? He says if you have that biblical worldview, if you view the world through the eyes, through the filter of the scriptures, then you will shine like stars. Not only because you read it and you know it, and you have 1,000 verses memorized. The Pharisees knew the Bible, right? But Jesus called them hypocrites. It's not enough to know it. It needs to transform our lives. Finally, finish up this with, we're working on it, Paul's boast. This is verses 16 through 18, so I read half of 16, I'm going to read the other half of 16. And then, excuse me, and then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on a sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you should be glad and rejoice with me. Paul says, if you do this, if you hold to the word of God, if you become humble and serve one another and consider the needs of others above yourself, if you don't complain and argue, he says, then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ when Christ returns. I did not labor in vain. He's talking about his founding of the church. I founded you. I am the founder of the church at Philippi. I founded you for a purpose. Not just, so that there'd be a church there and say, oh yeah, Paul founded that church. But he founded churches in cities throughout the Roman Empire, and his purpose, his strategy was that those churches would spread and expand and grow and spread the gospel in their regions. And he says, if you do this, then I will have been successful in my strategy. You will be a growing, expanding the gospel type of church. And I will be able to boast on that day, yeah, I didn't waste my time. But he says, even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. Paul here is talking about the possibility of his death. Remember, he's in prison. He's awaiting trial before Caesar. And it's very possible that he may be released. And sometimes he's confident of this. I'm confident of my deliverance because it's more important for me to be alive and to serve you than it is for me to die and go to be with Jesus, right? So he says, I'm confident that God's going to bring me through this and I'm going to survive. But then on the other hand, it's possible he may appear before Caesar and he may be condemned to die. And he says, either way, I'm good. If I am condemned to death, and he speaks of his death as a pouring out of a drink offering. And what this refers to is in pagan worship and also in the worship of the Jews, there was a drink offering. So that would be usually wine. It was poured out on the greater offering. So the animal's there on the sacrificial altar. It's about to be burned up, and you pour out a drink offering either on the sacrifice or beside the sacrifice. This was done in Judaism as part of the law, and it was also done in pagan worship. This was the libation, the pouring out of the libation. And Paul says, your sacrifice, your faith is like a sacrifice to God. And all of my efforts and my death, possible death, is just like the drink offering you pour out on top of that. Yours is a big sacrifice. Mine is just that, libation. That's humility for you. And Paul says, even if I die, even if I'm poured out, he uses those words later in 2 Timothy, which is the last letter he wrote. He says, I am being poured out as a drink offering. Paul seeing there that he would not survive. So here he says, I'm poured out. But even if I'm poured out, even if I die, I rejoice. And he says that you should too. And he challenges the Philippians to see their life and their faith as an act of worship. As an act of worship. Your faith, your life in Christ is like the sacrifice on the altar. It's an act of worship. Paul would write in Romans, or he did write in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Our lives are an act of worship to God. Paul says, my life is an act of worship to God. It's a sacrifice to God. And even if I'm poured out, even if I die, I'll rejoice. And you should too. I don't have a fancy conclusion here. I'll just leave that with you, and let's stand for